This is the Everyone's Agnostic podcast with Cass Midgley.
We interview people you don't know about a subject no one wants to talk about. We hope to encourage people in the process of deconstructing their faith and help curb the loneliness that accompanies it. We think the world is a better place when more people live by sight, not by faith. Please subscribe to our podcast and leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts. Also, you can support us monetarily in 2 easy ways. You can pledge
$1 million
or more through Patreon. That's patreon.com/EA podcast, or leave a lump sum donation through PayPal at our website, everyone'sagnostic.com. The smallest contribution is greatly appreciated.
I want to be in a place that's, for lack of a better word, soul enriching. I think that we are all stardust, and I say that in a very secular way, but I want to live my life in a way that is idealistic, and I want to seek out what magnifies my spirit. The human spirit is this beautiful thing, and the problem of consciousness is an interesting one. I don't believe there's anything beyond this, but I still want to claim those words for myself, and I still want to be in communities where other people are interested in exploring, what is this connectedness that we have, and how do we companion each other through really significant, difficult transitions. There's so much grief around the loss of faith too, and there's really scant consolation that resonates and rings true.
Welcome, everyone, to episode 216 of the Everyone's Agnostic podcast. I'm Cass Midgley. I'm going to die. A big thanks to each and every one of our Patreon and PayPal supporters. No, my guest today is not Olivia Wilde. Her name is Rachel, and that's all she's going to go by today. She's here to talk about grief, especially secular tools for coping with grief. People, this is a great conversation. You're not going to believe how sharp Rachel is. Prepare to be a better person 2 hours from now, if you listen in one sitting, which no one does. So prepare to be a better person and more equipped to deal with grief whenever you get through with this episode. Between 2002 and 2011, Rachel moved 10 times for her husband's graduate education and career in ministry. The more she studied the scriptures and served in the church, the more her faith eroded. This was true for her husband as well. For him, addiction ensued and secrecy abounded. In 2010, Rachel left her religious tradition to explore new worldviews, including humanism and applied positive psychology. While she flourished in her newfound freedom, her husband languished, consumed by regret, self-doubt, and anxiety around the potential fallout of leaving the fold. 2 years later, Rachel's optimism was put to the ultimate test when her husband died in a car accident, leaving her widowed overnight with 3 boys to raise. Although surrounded by loving and well-intentioned family and friends, her support system offered definitively Christian comfort and consolation. This minimized her loss and compromised her ability to process her grief honestly and openly. Ever since, she's been exploring new pathways to navigate both life and death in the pursuit of wholehearted healing and reality-based hope. Her desire is to build secular communities of support for people whose lives have been disrupted by tragedy, transition, and loss, including and especially the loss of faith. Rachel is a resilience trainer and grief support specialist. Even though she talks about death and loss a lot, she's into all things mind-expanding, life-enriching, and joy-inducing. She is currently developing Resilience Without Religion retreats through her website, www.flourishingbeyondbelief.com. So before we get into our talk with Rachel, here's what God put on my heart this week to share with you all. And it has nothing to do with my talk with Rachel about grief. I talk to my animals as if they can understand me. My cat is particularly unresponsive to such banter. He thinks he's God, after all. Last night I ran into him in the front yard and said, "Hey, Cheech, how you doing?" Thinking of the hours he'd been out here laying around, staring off into space, realizing he doesn't know if his life is good or bad or if his day is going well. And I said to him, "You don't wonder if your life matters, do you? You don't ever think about what you want from life." They have no agency, after all. Are they lucky? They only know what their instincts tell them, I guess. Animals haven't eaten of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. They don't judge, except food. I guess they judge the best places to lay down. But they don't plan out their day or set goals or beat themselves up for failing, because they never fail. They just exist in the moment. They're zen. As humans, we say having no agency is bad, but being grounded in the moment is good. Having brains that are more advanced than our animal siblings has its pros and cons, does it not? Taking responsibility for our lives, taking care of ourselves, being stewards of our own happiness and or satisfaction. These are good things, mature and evolved things about being human, in some way superior to lesser animals. One of the many challenges of being human is taking advantage of our advanced brains by exercising agency while simultaneously sealing off the present moment from too much invasion from past memories or future fears, not being emotionally pulled into the cringe moments of the past or pulled into the fears of the unknown future. So, as Pete Holmes says on his podcast, You Made It Weird, let's get into it.
This is actually my first podcast. I'm
Okay. Now,
a novice.
Did you reach out to me?
Yeah, I reached out to you because I started listening to your podcast, and it's great and interesting and full of interesting people and ideas. And I think I stumbled upon it because maybe it came up in my feed as something I might like, because I was also at a time, and I still listen to Ryan Bell's podcast.
Sure. Did you hear my episode with Ryan? I mean, like when I was on his show?
I think I did.
It's 2 years ago. So it's way
I
way
feel
back.
like it's been a little while. But if I'm recalling correctly, and like before we get started, I would love to just clarify this in my own head. Like you, if I'm not mistaken, your story is that you were in ministry as well?
Yes.
And then you lost your faith while in ministry. You were still serving in a church when you started struggling with the loss of faith?
Yeah, but not a lot. Like the only thing I had deconstructed while still in the pulpit was I didn't believe in hell. I didn't believe in the inerrancy of Scripture. I'd already started unpacking that I didn't believe in the sinful rejection of LGBTQ, and then substitutionary atonement, where Jesus's death was a scapegoat. You know, I stopped believing in that. So, but what happened was as those things came out to my congregation, I just basically tried to make the case that the Scriptures were not. There was no need to be a Christian and worship the Scriptures as inerrant. In fact, I thought you could be a better Christian by allowing your agency to sift what was errant and what wasn't. And boy, that didn't go over very well. So, and then on top of the fact that my repressed sexuality as a Christian, just like I think it does with Catholic priests or anything else, it overflowed into places and ways that were inappropriate. Like looking at porn at my office as a school teacher in a Christian school after hours, but it got caught that I was looking at porn on my computer, and then so that just unraveled. And since I'm like 10 years out from deconversion, and I have no shame or guilt around my sexuality or my masturbation or anything that I do sexually. I'm just because nobody's getting hurt and anything else, and.
Right.
Anyway, it just became a part of my downfall. But in hindsight, like most heroes' journeys, you get kicked out of the village or something forces you out of that. And then you find yourself on this journey, and then you're grateful for that.
Yeah.
You're grateful that you got shown the door because you didn't have the courage to do it at the time. And that's
Yeah.
how I look at it.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And now that you mentioned that and reference that, I remember that part of the podcast because it resonated with me because I know my first husband, Noah, he struggled with porn as well. And when we tried to deconstruct what that was about for him, he just talked about how it was like this naked fairy tale of graphic acceptance and explicit intimacy. And he was like, no, like seriously, like a performance of happy, unencumbered people who are supremely accepting and like literally and figuratively letting it all hang out. And I appreciated that because
that's beautiful.
Yeah, it is beautiful. And it makes sense. And it makes sense that when you feel like all of this shame and non-acceptance about who you are and what you're wrestling with from the church, that you would look for it elsewhere. And I mean, God, porn in the church is such a huge issue.
Yeah. Now that you're saying, I've never thought of it like this, but watching people unashamed of their bodies, unashamed of their sexuality, enjoying sex, and doing it in front of a camera was just like, oh my God, did you know this goes on? Like, this is amazing, as opposed to like, oh, this is disgusting or dark or dirty.
Right. Yeah. There's like a fascination piece of it, but there's also there's something really beautiful about unencumbered acceptance, right? It's certainly not something that we get in the church absent of Christ. And I think, when people really start struggling with the deconstruction of their faith, like that can be, and I think it is for a lot of people, like a default. It's like something that works with our anatomy and our body. I mean, we're hardwired to want pleasure and release, and when we can't find that at church, I mean, hello.
No, right. You're gonna find it. It's a river, and if you dam it up in a place where it's supposed to go, it's gonna find its way in places where it's not, and that so this is where religion actually contributes to sexual misconduct and inappropriateness, in my opinion. And here's the irony. And we're not going to talk about sex. Sex is not our topic today, so we're going to get to it. But before we move on, I think this is relevant, and that is the irony. And I've said this before, but just the irony is that the people who think, for example, the fact that I freely look at porn, I freely masturbate, I'm unashamed about it, and people would say, well, you're obsessed with sex. And I want to say to the people that are uptight about it, you're the ones obsessed. In fact, the slogan for, I think, Hustler sex shops is relax, it's just sex. And that's, when I saw that, again, that was one of those things where it's like, oh my gosh, that's a mindset I can have. Thank you. I'm going to adopt that.
Well, I think too, just recognizing like we are these human animals. Yep. Like it works because it works with our surgical muses. Like it works with our anatomy. It makes us feel better. It produces feelings of unity biologically and feelings of reward and acceptance. I mean, for so many reasons, it makes sense that it's something that we would default to.
Sure. But one of the reasons that humans came up with religion to begin with is the need to give ourselves meaning and purpose that transcends the animal kingdom. Any way that we are equated or equaled with animals is not good, and so they're not going to go there.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, but I just think evolutionary biology demands that we acknowledge the parts of us that are wired as animals are wired.
Yeah. No, that's
some of our default behaviors. And I don't think you can have an honest conversation in church or outside of it without acknowledging like that piece of who we are and making space for it and just giving ourselves permission to be human. So like, granted, sure, we can make meaning, we can forge meaning, we can do things that other animals can't do, but we still have all of this chemistry that works in a very particular way.
Yeah. Well, and whatever meaning making that we do, as much as we have some leeway with creativity and imagination and even some mythology, however, I'm leery and skeptical of meaning making that just outright leaves facts,
right,
or contradicts facts. Nope, you don't get to have that meaning and still claim or have some kind of intention to be honest or to, because I don't know. I still think Jesus's comment that the truth will set you free is still true. And,
sure,
and that if you're going to form a meaning or a life narrative, wherever it detours from the truth, it's going to be toxic. So
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. And ultimately, meaning making has to be wedded to reality. I've seen so many people who have maybe left their religious tradition to adopt a different kind of magical thinking. And, I'm certainly not somebody who subscribes to this idea that the universe is unfolding as it should. And I don't think anybody who's had to wrestle with, really deep grief or tragic loss can hold that worldview. But it's amazing to me how many people do.
Yeah.
It's just interesting. I know like Steven Pinker talks a lot about magical thinking, and it's just interesting how we trade one set of sort of false beliefs for another set of false beliefs.
Right.
Which I think is why humanism is so appealing to me. Like there's always space to reframe and to come up with new ways of seeing and being in the world and to challenge. Which I think is super important.
Well, I know I did this. I tapered off my faith just because I think probably neuroplasticity takes a while, and my brain was just trained to need meaning. And so I did the fundamental evangelical down to progressive evangelical, like Rob Bell or Brian McLaren, and some of the more liberal Christianity. Then down to unity. Anyway, stair-step down to like Oprah Winfrey and eventually just said, it's all...
Therapeutic deism?
Yeah. So I did. I went there too, as far as just no personal God, but yet, leaving. And that's the reason, people are critical of the name of my show is that everyone's agnostic. And the only reason I keep it there is it's worked actually in this case is that some people wouldn't listen to my show if the word atheist was in the title. Although, and my former co-host Bob Pondilla and I, we're both hardcore atheists, but there's something about saying, all right, if you're going to come to this table and you're going to reason together, we're going to discuss something, then there has to be at least some level of humility that says, yeah, this is what I think. I'm pretty sure about it, but ultimately I don't know. And so it's just a way of engaging with some humility. That's all.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think that's a character strength. And that's certainly a remnant of my religious tradition that I would want to maintain because it's as a virtue, I think it's important. And the only means for true engagement, you can't posture yourself
as curious
any other way. As curious and open.
If you already know it all.
Right. Yeah. No, that is really important, which actually leads me to one thing that I think that you've talked about this, and I think probably Ryan's talked about it at different times, but just how ugly dogmatic atheism is to me, just as much as fundamental Christianity. Like it makes me bristle because there's no room for any uncertainty. And I'm a meaning maker too. I definitely want to make sense of things, but there has to be just a little bit of room for not knowing and mystery and growth. And it's just so ugly when people are so dug in. Like we have to have the luxury of changing our mind.
Yeah.
Learning.
Well, you just inferred that your religious tradition was that there was a level of agnosticism and humility there.
Well, there was a level of humility, certainly, because I always wanted to learn and to understand. And
well, that's what got you here.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it was like a zealousness for it. And the thing that brought me to my knees was studying the scriptures and serving in churches and feeling like there's just this huge disconnect and incongruency between what I'm reading and what I'm seeing and my actual belief system and experience. And that's where it all fell apart. And what was really interesting is, so my first husband, Noah, was in seminary took him 6 years to finish a 4-year degree from Westminster Theological Seminary. And at the end of his studies, and we had been serving in the church this whole time, and at the end of his studies, you have this apologetics course where they're having you read, Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens and like all of these really brilliant, capable writers who have kind of ripped into this tradition that we've just spent $80,000 and many years of our life devoted to. And we get to the end of this seminary experience. And I remember Christopher Hitchens and Doug Wilson were debating about a book that they had co-authored about whether God was good for the world or whether Christianity was good for the world. I don't recall the name of the book, but there was a documentary called Collision that was made about it. But Noah was on the video camera and his job was to film this. And it was really interesting what happened in that.
Wait, he was in the room?
Yeah, he was in the room.
Oh,
he was
shit.
at Westminster. We hosted it, and we went out afterwards.
No
and
way.
just kind of
with Hitch?
Yeah, but like we didn't. I mean,
Fuck you!
apart from-
Oh my God, I'm so jealous.
Well, it was cool. Like, yeah, his hair was really greasy, by the way.
Oh
but
yeah,
anyway,
he was unkept.
he's so charming. Like his just manner of delivery and his accent are so winsome that it's just really hard not to like him.
For sure. Yeah.
And so, we went out. It wasn't like a close, bosom conversation or anything. There were plenty of other people in the room, but it was just interesting because I remember that was a turning point for Noah, and he was like, "Oh crap!" Like,
oh, for sure. Yeah, I did the same thing.
Yeah.
It's horrific to just like, oh, that was much ado about nothing. It's shocking, not only in my own life, my own wallet, and on my own time that I gave to it, but just I think about all the cathedrals around the world.
Yeah.
I think about all the church on every corner, just the massive brainwash tractor beam hold that this thing has on humanity. Yeah. If it was the work and intent of like an evil Dr. Evil, then it would be like extremely successful. But the fact that it's just kind of almost a product of our own human insecurity and fear, and it's just got not only a death grip on us, but we have a death grip on it.
Yeah, it's complicated, but I would say, it's definitely the seedbed and we constructed these things because we were afraid, but we also constructed these things because we wanted to be inspired. And so there's something really beautiful about that too. And I struggle with all the wasted resource and potential when it comes to what humanity can do and build. And if all of those resources were poured into actually things that were wedded to this life and this time and this reality that we're all sharing, it would be such a different world that we live in. Like, I appreciate the aspiration. And I don't know like how interested or familiar you are with like Alain de Botton and School of Life. And,
totally. Yeah.
I mean, it's just like, I appreciate this, like, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater idea. And it's so important to look at like, what need is it that the church has met? And like, how do we fill that need in ways that are more secular and more conducive to actual well-being?
Well, and also one of the benefits of not over-shaming not only the human race, but yourself forever believing it. You can just, I regret it. I'm so ashamed. No, give yourself a break. It served you just like it served the human race. Right. It's part of our survival. And but I think what I hear you saying in this is just that, all right, we needed the training wheels. It helped us. And now we need to stop putting gold rims on the training wheels. We need to take them off the bike. We need to learn to ride on our own. We're just investing in the training wheels when they're totally unnecessary at this juncture in the 21st century.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's so much research emerging too around like what kinds of things are actually conducive to human well-being. And it's so interesting to me as I've been studying like applied positive psychology and this whole field of well-being that so much of what religion teaches is actually counterproductive to really fostering well-being. So, I mean, even just really simple things, for instance, Brene Brown does all of this research around shame, right? Everybody needs to feel deep love and belonging, but we're taught in the church, like, no, you should be ashamed and you aren't worthy of deep love and belonging unless you belong to Christ. And so it's like, whoa. Yeah. Whoa. Like, and so people leave their faith but they've got this conditioning and it's really hard to even once you've acknowledged and accept, okay, maybe this tradition isn't true for me. Maybe these things aren't true. Maybe I'm not who I was told I was, but to reclaim your identity as something that's not shameful is really tough. And I mean, I watched Noah struggle with that terribly, tragically. And it was just, I mean, he was not comfortable in his own skin because, he had been raised from such a young age to believe he was this sort of like prophet of God. He's going to change this corrupt capitalist church. He's going to do all of these amazing
and anything less than that is a failure.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So as you were talking about information, and I think information is our savior. Like there's a superhero coming called Information Z, and I say Z because it's gender fluid. and information is the demise of bad ideas or destructive narratives.
Yeah.
And then secondly, you were talking about belonging and the whole Brene Brown thing. One of the things that comes up on this show a lot is the tension that we felt in the church, or really in our families if they were dysfunctional. And that is, I have to choose between being authentic or belonging, because I can't be both. If I belong, it's because I'm disingenuous. If I'm authentic, they don't let me in.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a real struggle. And I mean, goodness knows, I mean, in many traditions, you get excommunicated. Mm-hmm. It's not even just a question of whether you're accepted. I mean, you're vehemently not welcome. I lived in Amish country in Lancaster country in Pennsylvania, and we saw that. We saw that in different churches, and I think too, certainly when we were leaving the church, and Noah didn't actually leave openly, and he died, and most of the people in our life still thought that he was, deeply religious, because he was really terrified of what the fallout would be. Yeah. In the wake of his death, I was really afraid that it was going to hurt people more to know about his struggles. Their bubble. Yeah, and I had to plan, and this was probably the hardest thing I've done, although there have been hard things since, but I had to plan a Christian funeral for somebody whose life I wanted to honor and who I loved deeply and who I believe really was aspiring to understand the truth and live a good and meaningful life, but whose worldview was shifting. And I had to plan this Christian funeral in 6 days and think about the 400 other people who would be in the room and how they knew him and how they would want to honor his life. And that was pretty traumatic for me. And then to spend the next, 6 years, even now, a lot of people don't know what he was struggling with. And I had referenced when we were corresponding that he struggled with alcoholism, and it manifested itself in some very interesting ways that I didn't recognize from the beginning. But I think it was because he was wrestling so deeply with who he was and whether or not he would be acceptable in the eyes of his community, because he wasn't who he wanted to be, and he wasn't who he was told he needed to be in Christ.
Yeah. And he wasn't who they wanted him to be, and he knew it.
He wasn't who they wanted him to be, and he wasn't who they told him he was. I mean, from a very young age, he was told that, as I said, he was going to do these amazing things for the kingdom. And to lose that identity, and I mean, it's earth-shattering.
Absolutely. Especially, I was the only boy in a family of 3 sisters, and there was just this big pressure on me to be the guy because my dad's 2 brothers didn't have any sons, and so I was the only one to carry on the name, and I just kind of felt this pressure. And then at age 17, my father dies. And that whole, I don't know if it's, the bar mitzvah type thing as far as give you your manhood or give you your path or help you feel like you have legs underneath you to walk your own path or whatever. I never got that. And so when Jesus and Christianity came along, or in this case, a prophet came along and laid his hands on me and said, there's a call of God on this one. This guy's got it. Can you feel the power? God's hand is on your life. There's a big future. Your willingness to hear him, I send me. God's going to take you places. You're going to change the world. You're going to impact lives. And all of a sudden, I had my stamp. I had my purpose.
Right.
And then you take that away, and that leaves a vacuum of identity.
Yeah, a huge vacuum of identity and no community within which you can explore what the alternatives might be.
Yeah. Well, your website that you formed, Flourishing Beyond Belief.
I just did that yesterday.
Oh my.
That was fast and dirty.
Seriously, that was a good-looking website.
Oh, well, thanks. So, I have this aspiration. I want to figure out how do we bring people together wrestling with this stuff.
It's a place where people, like you just said, there was no community for your husband, and it's trying to create such a place. And to be honest with you, that's what this show is trying to create a place. And unbeknownst to me, and a byproduct that I never could have foreseen, is that huge community has formed around this show.
Cool.
So they heard another person on the show. They contacted them, or they became friends on Facebook, and before you know it, there are networks and online virtual communities of people where it is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen as far as this place, and it's a secret, Facebook group. They come on there, and in many cases, it's the only place that they can let their hair down or be themselves, and it's safe. Yeah. Oh, and it's so beautiful to watch because they come on and they just say, oh my gosh, I'm going to visit my parents this weekend. and it's so tense and it's so awkward, and then all these people jump in and say, you can do this, or give them tips or give them ideas or ways to navigate this minefield. It's just fucking gorgeous.
It sounds beautiful, and I want to be a part of that Facebook group.
I'll let you in.
I'm so desperate and eager to be in a community of people who do think deeply and who do care deeply. Mm-hmm. Like I'm not into angry atheist conversation. Sure. Like that's not where I'm at. I want to be in a place that's, for lack of a better word, soul enriching.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think that we are all stardust, and so I'm not. I say that in a very secular way, but I want to live my life in a way that is idealistic, and I want to seek out what magnifies my spirit.
Right.
And I say that again in a very humanistic way. Like the human spirit is this beautiful thing, and the problem of consciousness is an interesting one. I don't believe there's anything beyond this, but I still want to claim those words for myself. And I still want to be in communities where other people are interested in exploring, like, what is this connectedness that we have, and how do we companion each other through really significant, difficult transitions?
Yeah.
Like there's so much grief around the loss of faith too. And there's really scant consolation that resonates and rings true. I mean, I've moved in all of the circles of like positive psychology, people who are universalists and who are, overly optimistic, and their worldview is not wedded to reality.
Yeah.
And that's not my tribe.
No. We call it woo woo.
Yeah, it is. It is woo woo, and I love a lot of those people. And
they're beautiful,
interesting, and engaging. But I'm like, I can't. The conversation at some point comes to a grinding halt.
Well, it's almost like the moment that you're with a Christian and they start, or you figure out it's the guy that's fixing your dishwasher, and he starts talking. You go from talking about the dishwasher to like, where do you go to church? And you're like, okay, we're done here. And so the woo woo person starts talking about their spirit animal and something. However, that being said, what I also hear you saying is that if you did, a friend of yours, somebody said, hey, here's a little quiz to figure out what your spirit animal is, and you did it, and you read some of the feedback, which is kind of horoscopy, but you read it, and actually some of it did impact you, maybe to the point of tears or some kind of resonance. So what?
Yeah.
Good on you. You borrowed from the smorgasbord of human thought. And so I'm just saying both and. It can get woo-wooey, but hey, if it gives you a shot in the arm and puts a smile on your face and helps you get out of bed, who's to judge?
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And I think the question is always like, is this serving me in a way that resonates? And I think it needs to resonate emotionally and intellectually for me. In my case, for some people, maybe that's not true. I don't know.
Right.
But does it resonate? Does it feel true? Does it sound true? And am I comfortable with using this at this point in my life and in my journey? Mm-hmm. And being open to releasing it when it no longer has a place. Like I'm okay with that. I have no problem with that. And so it opens up a lot of conversations with people who, believe in all sorts of things that I don't think I ever could or would. But it's this common humanity that we share. I mean, again, we're all just trying to make sense in a world that's a little bit absurd.
Yeah. And when it comes to Mark saying that religion's the opiate or something, I think the point at which it becomes an opiate is the point at which it now, somewhere down the road, it does no longer serve you, and yet you cling to it because it got you through a certain chapter of your life. Now it's an opiate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree. It's interesting because even in religious circles, and I use the term religious broadly, but there's a lot of talk recently about spiritual bypassing. Mm-hmm. Which is like when something is no longer serving me, I'm just going to chalk it up to this is one place of mystery that I just don't get, but I'm not going to think about it too hard. And I'm not going to actually rumble with the emotions that are coming up and the beliefs I have around this. I'm just going to ignore it, which is uber dangerous. And even people who are in religion understand you can't just avoid, in the same way that you can't avoid dealing with grief. You can't just avoid the uncomfortable parts of our human experience. And it's interesting because I think the whole spiritual bypassing things happens a lot in religious communities, and then it manifests itself in all sorts of really maladaptive behavior that can't be ignored. And then people come back to this like, is my religion serving me or is my religion hurting me? Do I believe this? But it's interesting. Like, none of us want to be in a place of deep discomfort, so we just ignore.
Yeah.
All of the challenging things.
Oh, so true. All right, I think we're 30 minutes in, and we're going to get to the subject that really you came to me with and intrigued me, because we don't talk about it. Out of 200 episodes, I don't know that we've ever really talked about it, zeroed in on it, and yet I guarantee you it affects everyone that's listening to the show or has lost their faith. And we talk about it all the time on the show and in these groups where they say, look, I'm going to this funeral, or it's very close to home. My father just died. My grandmother just died. And it comes up a lot where people just literally ask right out, how do I cope with this? So you, because we've talked about it openly, but so how old are you now?
So I'm 43.
And your husband died how long ago?
I lost Noah 6 years ago, just over 6 years ago. But I had actually, before he died, I had started wrestling with my faith a couple of years prior.
Sure.
And so there was a lot of grief and loss. A lot of the time people just equate grief with the death of a loved one. But I think grief is any experience where there's significant loss and transition. And it can even just be like a change in familiar patterns of behavior. So there can be grief around having a baby. I mean,
or your babies grow up and leave.
Yeah, there are so many grief experiences I think understanding that is actually really foundational to understanding how to navigate those bigger losses that happen in life, because resilience is built incrementally. When we are able to wrestle with small losses and small griefs, it equips us to navigate and to put into perspective those bigger things. But losing my faith was a grief experience for me, because there was a lot of secrecy and there was a lot of loss of our community and a lot of loss of transparency and in relationships and being seen and known and loved for who I was. And so there was a lot of grief around that. And I started exploring humanism and applied positive psychology, which is really just about well-being psychology, before I lost Noah. And as somebody who, would have defaulted to all of the all of the comforts and consolations.
He's in a better place.
Offers. Yeah. Like I had a different place to go to.
Yeah. Oh, by then. Oh, that's great. And
by then.
That's what we're talking about. No, of course it's not easy, because if it was easy, it'd be much more accessible to more people, and we wouldn't be crying out for more tools, because to be poignant, one of our guests and listeners, former guests, and she came on the show as Hope. She'd had this horrific life where she had an affair with a pastor, and then, that fucked up her faith. And then the church blamed her, of course, victim blaming. And there was just all this shit had happened to her that was tragic. And just a year ago, her husband, with two small children, 9 and 11, I think were the ages of her children, committed suicide out of the blue, blindsided, didn't see it coming at all. And to this day, she's been in a tailspin. She's had some moments of relief and sanity, and I don't mean that in a crazy way, but and then before you know it, these waves come right back in, and she's screaming for help, real tools. And so it's extremely valuable. There's not high pressure, but I'm ready to hear what your prescriptions are.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the first thing and the most important thing, and this comes from research, but I think it's also just super simple and obvious, and it's not necessarily something that's accessible to people who have left their faith, is that the most important thing to healing is actually social connection. And that holds true in everything in life, but most especially in grief. And so having a social circle of people who will embrace you without judgment, without analysis, without rote consolation.
Yeah.
And that can be super hard to find. And I think people are super well-intentioned, even in religious circles, where they want to give you this hope. And it can be more painful.
They want to fix it.
Yeah, they want to fix it. And that happens in secular circles too. People want to fix it. But I think just culturally, we're at this place where we're recognizing that people who are grieving don't need to be fixed. They need to be companioned. They need people to come alongside them and to just be in a space that's really uncomfortable. And unfortunately, culturally, we really suck at that. We're not good at sitting in silence.
Yeah. Well, this show has, we have literally talked about it every episode probably, but we've had special episodes where all we talked about was community building. Yeah. Bart Campolo and I share that passion, and then a couple of episodes back on his third time on the show is a guy named Peter Montoya. I highly recommend that episode for you, because here's a guy who's not only like building community, but like you're emphasizing, his desire is to build character, to enhance your life, to figure out how to live a more fulfilling life. So, and he doesn't use the word secular, and definitely not the word atheist anywhere in his text and his promotion material. He's absolutely,
that's awesome.
He has Christians in his group. This guy he's something else. And
I'm going to look him up.
Yeah, Peter Montoya. Yeah. I think that his website is thriveunion.com. Okay. But I think it was episode 211, maybe, just a couple episodes back. And anyway, so the social community, number one, this is what's going to at least soften your landing, or somehow gird you up, it's like spotters on a ropes course where you can free fall and be trusted to fall in gentle arms or something. It's got to help.
Yeah, having that community, but I would even argue that because we're meaning makers, and and death is something that is so difficult to make sense of, even though we know it's a natural part of life. I think all of us still struggle with it.
It will always be a mind fuck.
Right. It absolutely will be. And acknowledging that is important too, but our minds are so terribly uncomfortable with uncertainty, and so we have to make meaning around it. And so having people who will allow us to write a new story around what that relationship was, what that relationship can still be. Because I believe that even when somebody dies, you still maintain a relationship with them, not necessarily in, obviously not in a physical way, not even necessarily in like a spiritual way, but it's still, certainly I still talk to Noah.
Yeah. I still talk to my dad.
Yeah. And my relationship with him is ongoing because I'm parenting his children, and I still have very strong emotions around him leaving. And I have very strong emotions around the gift and the legacy that he left to my children, in the way I see him in their humor and in their worldview and in their mannerisms. And there is something transcendent about the quality of a person, even when they're gone. And I think that, as a humanist myself, and as somebody who's secular, maintaining that connection is actually really important too. And being in a community of people who will allow you to figure out okay, so that connection doesn't look like a reunion in heaven, but that connection, that ongoing connection, looks like me continuing to retell this story in a way that makes sense, and to continue a relationship with this person in the way that I see their legacy and the energy that they left behind in the world.
Yeah, and I think that maybe the importance of of rewriting or telling a story is, otherwise, to use a biblical phrase, you're a reed tossed to and fro by the wind. Because, especially say in Hope's case, she can go from absolute hatred and anger because you abandoned us, you motherfucker, to, oh my God, you were the dearest, nearest, best friend and soulmate of my life. I miss you.
Yeah. 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 And I think all of us go through that. And, the circumstances surrounding Noah's death were pretty sketchy. And I'm not going to get into that here, but it was really tragic. And there's a lot of secrecy around the night he died. And it was really messy to make sense of his accident and his experience and why it happened. And I think that's another thing that needs to happen, and people need to be able to do that in the wake of grief, is to reconcile all the conflicting emotions that come with losing somebody. We can't enshrine somebody, and we can't bedevil somebody. That's not the totality of a person. It's not so polar. We need to reckon with all of the conflicting emotions. And again, our minds are not comfortable in that space because it feels incongruent. And we also feel okay, if we acknowledge all the crappy things this person does, that is going to minimize my grief.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
And
yeah.
if I only reckon with all of the awesomeness this person was, and that they were the most incredible, funniest, brilliant,
Yeah.
loving human beings that I've ever known or known of. And I mean, in the case of Noah, he was incredible. But if I enshrine him, then I'm not giving due recognition to all of these other emotions that are true for me.
Yeah, for sure. Just as a side note, I know that you're doing and you're planning and you're organizing retreats for people to actually come and go through maybe this group training or therapy when it comes to dealing with grief. And I have a little video. I don't know if you ever incorporate movie clips, but that point that you just made, as sometimes we turn to demonizing the person so that we'll feel less, and we can numb ourselves by making them an asshole. And that story, and then the opposite, where we make them saints, and both are meaning-making ways to help us comfort ourselves and ease the pain. So what I'm getting to is there's an old movie called Razor's Edge, and my favorite actor of all time is Bill Murray. And this is actually a serious role that he does. It's not a comedy movie. I mean, it's got its funny moments, but it's a World War I environment. He's in the field. He's actually a medic, and their truck, their ambulance, gets hit by a mortar, and a guy that he had just met, like this was his first mission with this guy, and he's really young, dies in this explosion. And the scene is that Murray gets down on the ground and is laying. I think they just tried like CPR on him or something, and nothing was working, so they gave up. And Murray just collapses to his side. So he's laying right next to him, kind of propped up on his elbow, and he's looking him in the face. And there's other guys standing around, and it's quiet and it's awkward. And Murray starts saying, "He was a liar. Have you ever heard him lie? Did you hear how much shit he would make up? He was a liar." And, that's the end of the scene. There's a later in the scene where another person dies, and he said, "He was a slob. Did you ever watch him eat? You could feed starving children with the food that just remained in his beard after a meal. He was a slob." But it's just, and you're going, oh my gosh, I see what he's doing, and it's just a good scene. Anyway, Razor's Edge, Bill Murray. Maybe. No,
that sounds awesome. And what I appreciate is that, we do so often try to placate ourselves by selectively numbing all of the negative emotions, and unfortunately, they don't go anywhere. You can't will them away.
They go under the rug, and then they become a monster of pus and blood and anger, and they'll come out. They create a volcano one of these days.
Well, yeah, and I mean, I think that also speaks to this idea of forgiveness. And again, I feel like for those of us who have come from a Christian tradition and many other religions as well, forgiveness is something that we've really only been taught can be truly found in Christ. And I think we need to rethink forgiveness as something that we actually do, not even for the person who's transgressed against us, but that we do for ourselves, because we don't want to carry all of the unwelcome emotions around, somebody having violated us in some way.
We used to use the terms appropriate the blood of Jesus over this transgression. I'm going to forgive you because Jesus died for you, or he suffered for you. So
yeah, how about I'm going to forgive you because I don't want to carry this crap around anymore.
Yeah, perfect.
I forgive you because I feel angry and all sorts of other emotions that I don't want to carry. And it's not about you deserving forgiveness or not deserving forgiveness. Yeah. It's not about that.
And there is that place where, these emotions, this anger doesn't serve me.
Right.
Yeah. All right. So far your work has kind of come up with number one, as far as dealing with grief, social community, some other things like retell the story, reconcile conflicted emotions. Am I on track so far?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't really have a formula for it.
I
These
know,
are just
but
some
I'm
of
going
the
to try
things
to
that,
make one out of it.
yeah. All right, go ahead. This will be a collaborative effort. So I think another thing that has been really helpful, certainly to my own healing, but I see this too, even in my client work, is understanding what your strengths are, what your character strengths are, and what you truly deeply value, and using that as a stepping stone for healing. So, for instance, even before I lost Noah, as I was trying to reconstruct my faith, I want to be a good person. I've always wanted to be a good person. I feel like I have a really strong, moral bearings and am very rooted in my values, although some of my beliefs have changed. But there was some really interesting research done by Martin Seligman and Chris Peterson, who are considered the founding fathers of applied positive psychology. And they had looked at many decades of research in psychology and kind of realized there is this disproportionate amount of research around what's wrong with us and all of our dysfunction and pathology. And there isn't anything to balance that out in terms of understanding what is conducive to a life of well-being. How can we put some systems and some things in place to prevent people from getting to a place where they have these pathological problems? And of course, that's not always true because there's a huge genetic component as well. But they were looking at the DSM and thinking what would be the opposite of the DSM? And they concluded understanding what universal values drive people and have throughout time and history would be the opposite. So what values do people draw on and use both to enrich their lives when things are good and also to use in places of difficulty, and how do they use these things in resilience? So they came up with this values in action guide, and VIA Institute, Values in Action Institute, has actually a free online assessment that everybody listening to this podcast should go do, because it's a quick questionnaire, and what it does is it tells you what are your go-to values and how can you put them in action and use them as a strengthening source when you're going through difficult things. And so for me, for instance, an appreciation of beauty and excellence is one of my highest character values. And when Noah died, it was really good therapy for me to just get out and go to the botanical gardens and to appreciate all of this life around me, even in the wake of his death, and to sit with that and to savor that. And for me, kindness is a really huge value. And so to find other opportunities to extend kindness to other people, even though I was in a lot of pain. And there's actually 24 character strengths that were identified as being sort of universally recognized across time and space. And when people understand what their top 5 character strengths are, you can really use that when you're navigating difficult transitions, and even use that when life is great and grand and you just want to have a more enriched experience. So, for my kids, humor, my one son, Levi, humor is one of his character strengths. And even in the wake of his dad's death, he was able to find really funny, absurd things that were going on, and to use that to just break the tension. And it's so beautiful when people are aware of what those values are and when they're feeling really low to be able to deploy them.
Yeah. Well, the image I have in my mind is this: you're in a laboratory and you have this glass jar of acid or something, and you take a droplet of some other chemical that really neutralizes the toxicity of that acid. And so literally just letting, say, a beautiful orchid hit your eyes, transfer electronically to your brain, and then that's that droplet. I mean, it's just by looking at beauty, you're going to neutralize some of the acidity that is eating at you. And in your son's case, and I relate to that, and here's what I want to say about using humor. It is something that is probably not for all ears, because I have used humor in places where it was, in their minds, deeply inappropriate, but yet it was working for me. And so I'm just saying that you might, people that use humor like your son and I, there's probably some degree where we might want to keep that to ourselves in certain contexts. That's all.
Yeah, I would say with discretion, but here's the thing. Like, I don't know. I reserved the right, and Noah's sister and I at his funeral, like, had moments where we were laughing because all of it just felt so absurd. And like going in and choosing a coffin and having the option of putting, like a brass bass on the front of the coffin. I'm like, God, this is
like
so
bass, as in
up.
he was a fisherman?
No, like he's not a fisherman, but there are all of these accessories that you
Yeah.
can put on the coffin before you put it in the ground.
Oh,
like,
yeah.
I mean, it was just messed up. And like, we were laughing, and I'm sure that anybody on the outside looking in might have felt like that's deeply inappropriate. But like, you know what? If humor is my character strength, or the character strength of somebody who I know and love and who's here and is using it to console me, I don't care if the rest of you think it's inappropriate.
Right. Good for you.
Well, the question is how you use it. I mean, it would be insensitive to say something that you think is funny, and when you're not like as deeply connected, maybe to whoever's been lost.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I mean, I just feel like all of us need the permission to be human and to sometimes say like, okay, that's his way of coping. That's Cass's way of coping.
Yeah. Right.
Maybe a little uncomfortable for me, but like I'm gonna give him that right. I'm gonna give him.
Yeah, but you're talking about somebody really mature. I mean, you just that's a nice bar that you just raised. But yeah, that's who I want to surround myself with, because ultimately, if I'm not surrounded by people with tough skin or maturity, then it's just a matter of time before I hurt their feelings anyway.
It's true.
Let me
exhausting.
let me insert something here that, just for those that don't know, the DSM is kind of like the manual of the psychological world of dysfunctions and pathologies. I think there's 10, and the kind of the spectrum of each one of them. And so by writing something that is the opposite, or at least like, instead of these are the 10 things that are wrong, that can go wrong with the human psyche, here's 26 or 25 things that can go right, and you already have them in your arsenal or in your toolbox. You just don't know you do, and taking a quiz like this helps you bring it to the fore of your mind and memory and know that you can reach in there and use that in times of need.
Right. Yeah. So like another really good example of that, and I think a lot of us who are maybe in this community probably have this as a character strength, is maybe a love of learning, and then a second one of curiosity. And I mean, for me, that was really important in my healing process too. So, okay, how do other people rebuild their life after the loss of faith? How do other people find communities of support when they traditionally have been surrounded by Christians, but now they're grieving the loss of somebody, and that's not going to be a comfort to them. So how do people do this? Like, what are the other options? Like, I'm a voracious reader. So I'm like, there's got to be a way. There's got to be an answer out here. So, whenever I get really discouraged and feel super alone, I'm like, okay, learning is something that I do. It's something that I'm good at. It's something that I'm drawn to. Like, there are answers to these things.
Well, and I think when I hear I'm a voracious reader and I'm going to get to the answers, be honest with you, I hear fatigue in that, as far as I've done that. And I think, but pairing that with the fact that you like beauty is that sometimes when you have looked under every rock and you're exhausted and your brain's tired, then go to the garden.
Yeah.
It's
That's
both
actually
and.
very true.
Yeah.
It is. It's definitely both and or just watch a funny movie and just laugh and forget about it for a while.
Sure. There's a time to escape and there's a time to engage, and you give yourself permission to do both and be the manager of your own happiness.
Yeah. Yeah.
I love that.
absolutely.
The stewardship of our lives we got back when we left faith and we got our agency, and we basically said, I'm no longer apologizing for being human, and I've got some issues. This is why I think that where one of the main doctrines of Christianity gets past first base with true thinkers, and that is the doctrine of sin. And if they just come forward and say, hey, are you perfect? No. See, you got sin. And it's like, well, yeah. I mean, even when I left the faith, obviously I had to admit I'm not perfect, but there's nothing wrong with being imperfect. And
Right.
giving yourself a lot of slack. So before we go on, let's repeat again, like how or where people can go take that test or exam to identify their strengths.
Yeah, let me find the website, because I think it's viacharacter.org. So VIA, which stands for Values in Action, viacharacter.org. grief.org.
Okay.
And there's a free assessment. And I mean, there's also, if you want a really super in-depth one, you can pay for that. But I don't know that it's necessary. I feel like it might be helpful to some people, and other people just won't need it. They'll be able to, deduce what needs to happen or how this could serve them in their lives, certainly.
One of the things that I wanted to talk about that you mentioned in your bio is, so we're using some tools. We're talking about such tools as far as dealing with grief. Coming out of Christianity, we've already mentioned a couple of things as far as maybe the propensity to bury one's head in the sand we kind of learned from Christianity, or scapegoating, or sweeping things under the rug, not dealing with things, and all of which are similar in practice. But I thought maybe we could touch on, if you have some things specifically in mind, things that you had to unlearn from your experience with religion in order to better deal with grief.
That's actually a really great question.
Well, let me throw out one that I think might be potential, at least was for me. I think Christianity teaches and trains the mind to think in binary terms. So the knowledge of good and evil, which is ironic because the Bible actually condemns that kind of binary. I mean, it was the bad tree. And sure enough, we shouldn't have eaten of it. And so, but we do. That's what we do. And now sheep and goats, saved and lost, heaven and hell. There's all these binary things. And so that when you get out into the world or whatever, and you're dealing with grief and you're trying to be honest with yourself, I think there's a habit there. Yeah. And how does that manifest in your experience?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with that. And at one point I had written a blog post, although I never posted it, about the polarities of grief. Mm-hmm. And I think that's not just a product of religion necessarily. I think that's also just a product, again, of like us being these creatures who are deeply uncomfortable with uncertainty, and we want to make sense of things quickly, and we want to conserve our energy so that we don't have to rethink things again and again and again. But grief has this way of just mixing things up in your head, and it's very complicated, which is why I talk about like reckoning with conflicting emotions and making sense in the story. But there just are a lot of polarities of grief, and we have to learn to reckon with the whole truth of grief and to not force things into black and white, like, again, the enshrinement and bedevilment piece of things, or this person deserves or doesn't deserve forgiveness. It's not really the right question. It's not really the right framework within which to think about it. When you're in the throes of grief, you feel really conflicted about acknowledging things in any other terms, like, how is today? How are you doing today? Well, today I'm okay, but that doesn't mean I'm okay. I will be okay tomorrow. Like, the reality is that grief comes in waves, and we should be allowed the full expression so that there isn't this magical moment in time at which I'm healed and I've recovered. There needs to be space. But again, I feel like there is some residual effect of religion around this idea that if you really believe that you're going to see your loved one again, then it's really not such a big loss, and it minimizes the loss. When you have people around you saying like, oh, don't worry, you can talk to them anytime, and and you'll be able to see them, and you'll be reunited in heaven. And unlearning some of that stuff was really hard. And the finality of death is so difficult.
Are you familiar with Ernest Becker?
Come to terms with. I'm not.
Ernest Becker's book, The Denial of Death. I highly recommend it. It's my Bible, and to me, it explains everything. I mean, like why humans go to war. I mean, or why people get in the Olympics. I mean, it's just the drive, is driven by the denial of death, and it's the elephant in the room, and it's a powerful book.
No, I will look into that because I think that all of us are uncomfortable with it. And I think we live in a secular culture, too, that's very uncomfortable with dealing with grief and with looking at the complexities and being comfortable with all of the things that actually are gray around it.
Well,
we just want to be done with it.
Yeah. I'm sure that you and Noah both probably, as you were deconstructing, it's a very common pitfall. But, how did you navigate the temptation to kind of be a little nihilistic?
Yeah. Well, honestly, I did it because at the same time and before Noah's death, I had started studying this whole field of well-being and all of the research that was emerging from like the University of Pennsylvania and then subsequently around the world. And I absolutely do subscribe to, although not everything in it, Martin Seligman wrote a book, I think it's entitled Flourish. But he has this model or this theory of well-being. And again, there are many meta studies that informed the writing of this book and this theory. But he came to identify sort of 5 almost ingredients of what a good life consists of and what we need to build into our lives intentionally. And so I had already started doing that when Noah died. But then again, after he died, like that was my go-to. I'm like, there's a lot of research informing this. And so he has something called, well, people refer to it as the PERMA model. And PERMA stands for these 5 different categories, and it's since been added to, and I'll get into that. But the first of which is just positive emotions. Like if we want to live a life that is meaningful and enriching, that we need to be very diligent and deliberate about cultivating positive emotions, even in the wake of death. So making space for a little bit of laughter, making space for joy, and finding opportunities for awe. So for me, awe didn't come from contemplating God. For me, awe came from contemplating an orchid at Longwood Gardens. You know,
all right. So let's talk about that first P, this positive emotions. I think this is obviously nuanced, and we're complicated creatures. And so, because to me, there's a fine line between fake it till you make it and fostering or subjecting yourselves to things that help you have endorphins. For me, I literally intentionally, not just whenever I happen onto it, but just I seek out comedy. Because I, as a depressive and melancholy guy, I need laughter, and it's almost like I forgot to take my medicine if I don't do it.
Yeah. Well, there is something to fake it till you make it, but I'm not talking about ignoring negative emotions. I mean, they're absolutely a part of our existence. They need to be acknowledged.
Well, no, I'm talking more about like right before a football game, the coach gets everybody in a huddle, makes them bang their helmets against each other, makes them shout things like, "Who's going to kick some ass today? We are!" You know, and
I'm into that.
Well, that's what I'm getting to. It works.
Totally.
But why am I insulted by that?
Yeah, no, it works because because it feels a little bit inauthentic.
Yeah,
but it's not.
But it works.
Again,
the body responds.
We are wired. Doesn't it? We are hardwired. Like that is the animal part of us, and that's okay. And it's I don't know. I mean, we have shame around that too. It's like, we don't want to be manipulated. But wait a minute. Like maybe we ought to hack our biology and our hardwiring in a way that serves us. Like, so what? I mean, it also serves you to have a glass of wine if you want to relax. Like, so what? There's no shame around that. Okay,
you just changed my life because I'm that guy. I'm that guy that is so devoted to authenticity that I miss out on this other tool that you referred to as hacking our system. We're hardwired a certain way, and we can manipulate it, and that's okay. Oh my gosh.
We are, and we really literally are. We're neurobiologically hardwired to respond to particular stimulus in a particular way. And if we know that, why wouldn't we smell a flower? Why wouldn't we pour a glass of wine? Why wouldn't we watch late night with whoever in the wake of somebody's death? Why wouldn't we seek out laughter and joy and awe and all of these things? It's not a cheat. It's a cheat if you stay there.
Yeah.
You know, like I think the key, and this is true of positive emotions and negative emotions, and is that we need to have emotional agility. We need to digest whatever life is throwing our way without repelling it and without getting stuck in it. And when there's opportunity to savor it and to enjoy it, but to recognize, like as with everything, there are seasons, there are ebbs and flows. The totality of our human experience necessarily makes space for both. So I'm not suggesting false positivity. I'm not suggesting that like I'm not into happyology at all. I've had too much tragedy in my life, and I also it's just so inauthentic to me. Like I can't stand unicorns and rainbow touting people. Like that's just not my thing. But I don't think there's anything wrong with knowing like what brings me joy and how can I pursue that.
Yeah. What do you think, or have you read Dan Harris's 10% Happier?
I don't think I've read it, but I feel like I probably own the book and I haven't read it.
That's okay. Yeah. There's something vicarious about having it on your shelf that you get it by osmosis. That's what I tell myself, at least.
It's just good intentions, good intentions.
So you're saying a little bit of manipulation or self-manipulation, a little bit of escapism in moderation. It's okay, but don't stay there.
Yeah, don't stay there. I mean, acknowledge the other things in life that are happening and arising. I don't believe in living in a bubble of any sort, but I don't have any shame around actually actively doing things that bring me joy.
So some of the concrete things are real practical things that I think you prescribed today. That is something that is a real takeaway for people wanting tools to grieve better or more healthy, is this stuff by Seligman and Peterson. But how do you spell Seligman so people can Google it?
Sure. It's Seligman. And the book that he and Chris Peterson wrote, although it's kind of dense and pretty academic, and I'm not sure people will necessarily want to buy it, but I think if you go to viacharacter.org, you can get the gist of the content in a way that's valuable. But the book itself is called Character Strengths and Virtues.
Okay.
It's like a textbook.
Yeah.
Though.
But then there was Flourish, probably a little more accessible.
Yeah. Flourish is much more accessible by Seligman. And I think this subtitle, just looking at my bookshelf, is A Visionary New Understanding of Well-Being. Mm-hmm. And so we just touched on, like in talking about positivity, we just touched on
that's the PERMA, P of PERMA. 5. Yeah, what are the rest? Real quick.
Yeah. So really quick, engagement is the second sort of ingredient to a life of well-being. And engagement really includes any activity where you kind of transcend yourself and you're really in flow. So for some people, for instance, that might include playing music. For some people, that might be sports. For some people, that might be writing. For other people, it could be knitting. I mean,
for other people, it could mean getting out of bed.
Maybe.
I'm just saying. I'm just saying that if you're that depressed, if you're that an active engagement might start with just getting vertical.
Well, and engagement, I think in the way that Seligman uses that term is like when you're so engrossed in an activity that you lose all sense of time and sometimes some sense of self. Mm-hmm. So when whatever you're doing, you're just in that zone. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that's another term that is maybe used in the book, or certainly it's used in the research around it.
Yep.
It's just getting in the zone.
Good.
For me, that actually happened at work, which is kind of a weird thing. But I was
what is your work?
Engaged at work. Well, I do something different now, but I've been primarily in sales and marketing. But I was in ministry for a long time. But for me, I used to work at an event venue, and I used to really derive a lot of joy and also just be in a really good headspace when I was planning events for people. Mm-hmm. Just because it's my skill set, I'm good at it. The level of my skill and the degree of the skill required for the job were just well matched.
Yeah.
So when you're in the zone, when you're in a place of flow, it's challenging enough, but also matched to your skill set enough that you're just engaged. Mm-hmm. So that's another, and there's a whole body of research around that too. And then the third thing, and I think that the order of this is somewhat random, and maybe just put in the order of something that sounds like a word in PERMA. But the third sort of category that is super important is relationships, and we all know that. And if Chris Peterson, as I mentioned, he's sort of considered a founding father of this movement as well, says if he could whittle down the sum total of all of the research that's been done in applied positive psychology, it would simply be that other people matter. Mm. So recognizing our connectedness to one another, that we're social beings, that we need to have people bear witness to our life, that we need healthy, enriching relationships where we're allowed to explore, we're allowed to be curious, we're allowed to kind of reinvent ourselves as we are evolving on whatever personal journey we're on. Certainly in the body of research, there's a lot around romantic relationships and sex and sensuality and nonviolent communication and all of these things. It is so timely, this research around relationships, when it comes to understanding what healthy relationships look like as you're leaving the faith, because we've been taught in Christian circles anyways, like wives submit to your husbands, and we're not going to talk about, well, what if they are alcoholics or what if they are abusive? Just wives submit to your husbands and parents submit to your children. And, for us, we have to
vice versa. Children submit to your parents.
Or children submit to your parents. But we leave that faith tradition, but we're still left with some of the residual ideas around it. And so what that means for me is, even though I'm trying to heal in my grief journey, I can't acknowledge to my parents, by the way, I'm not a Christian. This is not comforting to me, because it would be somehow disrespectful to my parents to be seen for who I am. And so and I think that's why there is so much trauma around how relationships shift when you leave your faith and also when you lose somebody. Yeah. Both. Yeah. Because we've been conditioned in this sort of Christian bubble to not be honest because it's a matter of respect or disrespect.
Have you ever read Sam Harris's book, Lying?
Yeah, I have. It's been a while, but yeah.
He kind of makes that argument as far as we presume that our parents are going to react X, Y, Z or poorly or something. And, one argument is, well, you got to give them the chance to, don't write that narrative for them. Let them write it and just put yourself out there. I'm definitely one that errs on the side of honesty sometimes to a fault, but yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, you have to be gentle in that.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
I definitely believe in kindness as being a really important virtue. And I also, I'm somebody who's pretty good at managing other people's emotions because I'm super, hyper aware of the emotional dynamics in a room. And I never want to hurt anybody intentionally. And honestly, and here's something else that's really important in the wake of grief is for those people who are wired as I am, it's really hard to be honest with your own emotions, especially when they're conflicted, when you're so damn concerned about how other people are going to feel. And again, planning a Christian funeral in the wake of my husband's death, who was really struggling with his Christianity, sucked. But I'm I don't want to hurt anybody else's feelings. I'm not going to tell other people that he was wrestling with this really shitty stuff. And I'm still, even now, there are still things that I have kept from people because I don't want them to be hurt. But real, authentic relationships make space to have those conversations. And sometimes they unfold over years. I mean, Noah's sister and I just last summer had an engagement over email, actually, where I was so concerned about managing her emotions, but I was more concerned about being authentic with her. And so I found a way in kindness to say, okay, these are the things that I've really been thinking about and wrestling with. And my relationship to you is so important and I don't want to hurt you. And I need you to know these things so that you can know me.
So true. And that's the tension. Wow,
yeah.
That's tough. And we use this term brutal honesty. And I heard somebody say once, I'll take your honesty, but you can keep your brutality.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think there needs to be space for honesty and authenticity. And sometimes too, and here's the really hard truth, there are relationships post-religion that are just going to shift unalterably and probably, not probably, who knows? I mean, everything changes and maybe they'll be redeemed again down the road. But I think you have to let go of some relationships and say, just as you say with beliefs, this isn't serving me anymore. I think you look at relationships and you have to reevaluate and say, this relationship has changed. To what degree can I engage with this person? And what do I need to let go of?
Yeah. Yeah, my wife and I, we share this thing with a friend where we kind of, it's tongue in cheek to a degree, but the root is true, and that is, this is a 15-minute friend, this is a 2-hour friend, this is a weekend friend, and this is my lifelong friend. I mean, we have people that we can only handle 15 minutes of them, and that's enough.
Yeah. I don't know. I have no shame around acknowledging that. And different strokes, it's fine. Those people have inherent value. And it's not somebody I want to be in a room with for more than an hour.
Yeah. And surprise, surprise, not everybody's going to be best friends. So what?
Yeah. And plus they don't want to be with me either. So,
yeah, we can take this personal, or we can just say, oh no, that's reality. I'm fine with that.
Yeah.
The M of PERMA.
The M is for meaning, and I think this is absolutely something people struggle with in the loss of faith, but also in the loss of a loved one. Is we have to reconstruct meaning, and death is absurd and tragic and terrible, and of course it also makes sense at the same time. There are those sort of seemingly contradictory truths. We know it's going to happen, it's absurd, and it also makes sense. It's both.
Yeah, and I think, I don't know if you've ever dealt with something like this, but when somebody's 89 and they die, I mean, it's so much easier to take. But this, what was this recent thing? There was a shooting, and there were these people that were just innocently, it was right here up the road here from me at the Waffle House, middle of the night. These kids are there, and this young black girl was cum laude and getting ready to go, to get her master's, or just has her whole life out in front of her.
Sure.
And she's just having a waffle at 2:00 with friends, and some guy with no pants on comes in and shoots her. Well, that funeral's going to suck.
Yeah. Yeah.
There is no way to give that meaning.
Yeah. And sometimes there's not. And sometimes the meaning that you give it is that it's meaningless.
Yeah.
Like, this has no place in a world that I want to live in, and yet it happened.
Oh, wow. That's
And
how I
think
feel about the Trump presidency.
Oh God, doesn't everybody? But I think the way people imbue meaning into that situation is not into the situation itself. Like, asking why things happen is rarely a good question.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe it is to the degree that you can change an outcome for somebody in a similar situation in the future. But the pressing question is always, what happens next? Like, what's next? How do I forge meaning? Not how do I find meaning in a Christian sense? How do I forge meaning? How do I make sense of this for myself in a way that I can live with? And sometimes the answer is it's really damn hard, and it's going to be a lifetime of trying to make sense
It's a
of
life's
this.
work. Yep.
And not demanding that, like, that deep meaning. I also think there's a lot of like narcissism in religious circles, but also in circles of magical thinking, where people are like, oh, well, you know, I lost my child, but I've made good. I've turned it into something beautiful and good. And
I never would have met so-and-so if it wasn't for that death, or, you know, hyper meaning making.
Yeah. And it's like, yeah, sure. Like, you can make meaning around something, and like, to the degree that is true for you, use it and like let that have some meaning. But don't say like, the universe did this to me, or God did this to me so that I could learn a lesson, or so that I could meet so-and-so, or so that my life could unfold in a different way. Like, that's bullshit.
Here's the worst one.
Pop out.
Because he needed another angel.
Oh God, it's so gross. I can't even. It makes me so upset.
Yeah,
but it equally upsets me when people are like, well, you know, they're in a better place, and I needed to learn this lesson, and it's all about me. It's like gross. Like, no, it just happened.
Yeah,
it happened because it happened, and because we live in a world that is a little bit broken and a little bit messed up and a little bit absurd, and like, just sit with that. That's how I make meaning.
Yeah. Well, a lot absurd and chaotic and random is where I go, but that's just me. I'm a little bit more suited for that. I think when my father died when I was 17, I learned early on, this universe doesn't care and is out to kill me. You know, this is not a safe planet, or whatever.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, I don't disagree. I mean, I think there are objective truths, and yet I also, and this is why I'm a humanist, is because I believe that we can affect tremendous change and have tremendous agency, not universal agency, not divine agency, but like, I certainly believe that there are a lot of things that we can do, and to the degree that we can, we have a responsibility to affect change and to find opportunities to make meaning and to carve out new pathways. And I recognize, in the grand scheme of things, you know, it just doesn't even necessarily matter, but it matters for me today to feel like my life is meaningful. And I think that's where a lot of people, when they leave faith, really struggle and end up feeling a little bit nihilistic and hopeless, is that we've been conditioned to think there is no meaning in the universe absent of God. And I'm okay with meaning today. I don't need to have some grandiose cosmic scale story that my life is connected to. I mean, I don't know. I think that's narcissistic too. Like, why do I need to do anything grand and eternal? Like, I don't know. Why should that be the only source of meaning for me? Like, if I find meaning in reading a book to my child at bedtime and marveling at the miracle that is just this living, breathing human being that's a part of me, that's pretty awesome. That's meaningful for today.
Yeah. I think we've always struggled with our Christians telling us, atheists, you're arrogant to presume that there's no God. And I want to say, not just as a "nuh-uh, you are" type argument, but it's like, what's more arrogant than thinking that God made the whole universe for you or something? Yeah.
There's some truth to that. Like, it's really anthropocentric, and it's fascinating that people don't see that.
Yeah. Well, and I've never understood what it has to do with shoes, but one of my favorite slogans or ad campaigns was Nike's "Why Ask Why." And I felt like earlier you were saying it's not necessarily healthy to ask why this happened, or don't make meaning, but forge forward. And, because "Why Ask Why" is really, looking back.
I mean, sometimes it's helpful. I'm not saying it's universally unhelpful, but I'm saying oftentimes when something really tragic happens, and something that just seems so untimely, like the loss of, a child, asking why can be helpful to the degree that maybe you can do things differently in the future, but it's not helpful to the degree that you're going to get answers about the past. Like it's happened.
Yeah.
It's happened.
Or that you're
and we get
expecting
stuck.
answers and they don't come, then you're devastated.
Right. Right. And we just, like, our brains want to close the loop. We want answers. We want to make sense of it. But, like, it's just the wrong question sometimes.
Okay, so what's the A of PERMA?
Yeah, the A is accomplishment, which would be very closely tied into, purpose. So for people to have a deep sense of well-being, they need to feel like they're doing something of an accomplishment in their lives. And, for some people that involves leaving a legacy. For some people, it can take various forms for various people. And the role of this field of study is not to judge for anybody else what accomplishment can or should look like, but simply for people to have some sense of purpose and something that they're working toward and some means to accomplishing it, setting goals. There's a lot of self-regulation in there in terms of feeling like you have mastery over self. And again, this is actually something that's kind of different from, I think, our Christian tradition in that, we're told we don't really have a tremendous amount of agency and that we need to kind of wait for God to make things happen. Or
when you do accomplish something, you have to give glory to God.
Right. Yeah. It's attributable to something outside of yourself.
Yeah. Which kind of defeats what we're trying to get out of this one.
Yeah, it does. But the whole psychology of well-being is that, like, we actually need to feel like we have agency. We can do hard things and we can do things, by our own volition, by our own strength, and certainly with the support of community around us, but that, like, we have agency in the world. And I think that's true and necessary for healing as well, in the wake of grief. Like, we need to not be dependent on all of these outside resources, although certainly we need to draw on social support and the wisdom of all of the people who've gone before us in loss. But by the same token, like, we have agency and we need to set to accomplish new things and to dream new dreams and to find new purpose. And I think that's really, really important to well-being at the best of times, but also certainly at times when transition is really hard and painful.
I imagine when you were a Christian, you probably read some C.S. Lewis, right?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, but there was something about, his wife died and he wrote about grief and pain. And one of the things that came out of that book for me, and it ended up in a movie with Anthony Hopkins playing C.S. Lewis, where pain is the megaphone to rouse a deafening world or get people to look to God or something like that. And I'm sickened by that, that God would use pain to get our attention.
Yeah, I would say that pain is an opportunity for connection, though, but not necessarily with God, but with other people. And I think that that's where my default would be. I don't think C.S. Lewis is wrong in suggesting that pain can be a catalyst to something good, but I think where we look for comfort and consolation makes all the difference. A lot of people feel very isolated in their grief because they're afraid they're going to be misunderstood or judged. And I think that if we allow pain to connect us, it can enrich relationships in unimaginable ways.
It can also sift them because I have several, and I'm going back to the value of community and how much. My wife and I were just talking today how lucky we are to be surrounded by such dear, sharp, compassionate people. We're just, I think you've hit the jackpot if you've got good friends.
Yeah, where do you live? Where are your people?
You know what? There's a lot of people that are jealous of this Nashville group here, just because we do talk about it a lot. We meet regularly. We foster these things. We're intentional about these relationships. And this is some of our pastoral skills. Some of the guys in the group are former pastors, and we know how to build community.
And you love people, and you make space for people.
Yeah.
And that's beautiful and so enriching and so necessary. And I think that pain and hardship can draw people together. We see that in the wake of any kind of big natural disaster. It's not particularly sustainable.
No, but everybody rallies around when the tornado took your roof off and everything's beautiful. Yeah,
but isn't that kind of beautiful though? That's
Absolutely.
Also how we're hardwired as human beings like that. Yeah. To me, that's just incredible, and it's strange that we live in a culture where it takes something so catastrophic for people to feel like they need people. Yeah,
but it is some of the most enriching and fulfilling times of my life was when just working side by side with either strangers or enemies and friends to accomplish a central goal is like something just really beautiful about it. But the thing I was saying about sifting your friends, and it was kind of tongue-in-cheek, because I have, in particular, there's 3 guys that I lean heavily on. And I have been going through something for 20 months that has just been gut-wrenching and disturbing. It's thrown me into clinical depression and suicide at times. And at one point, and like what made me think of this is that you were saying that some people feel alone in their grief and they're afraid to talk about it because others won't relate to it. And my point is that I feel like I've worn them out. I've worn out my welcome. I've taxed them to the point where now they roll their eyes when they see the phone ring with my name on it. And so I brought it up to him once. I just said, I think I'm about to, wear out my welcome with you guys. And this was in public. I mean, in person. We were standing next to each other, and one of them looked up at the other one and said, do you know what he's talking about? I don't know what you're talking about. I mean, they really wanted to make it clear to me that there is no threshold that you're going to, or, some kind of quota or maximum measurement that you're going to, okay, now we're done. We're going to cut you off because you're wearing us out. And honestly, I needed to hear that, because when I would be lonely and maybe even spiraling and I'm almost a danger to myself, I'm embarrassed. I'm embarrassed that I'm in this place, and I don't want to call you. And so when I do call you, it's like, it's me again, and I'm really not doing very well. And I wish, it's very complicated. And so you have to kind of press through all those fears and imaginations in order to get help from friends.
Yeah, you do. You have to learn how to ask, and you have to learn who to ask. And I think that's really key. And recognizing that different people can be drawn on for different things or at different times is important, and knowing when and how to ask, but absolutely reaching out. But it sounds to me too, and this is a totally separate side of me, but it sounds to me too like you're stuck in some sort of maybe belief system or way of being, and like some of your fear maybe comes around. And tell me if I'm wrong, maybe I'm misunderstanding, but it sounds like maybe some of the fear comes around just going to the same people about the same stuff and feeling like, man, I'm ruminating. They've heard this all before. There's nothing new.
Absolutely.
I'm being needy. So I would actually challenge you, like, find a professional in your area who can help you work through this stuff.
I'm seeing someone, and I'm completely pro therapy and unashamed and unabashed in going. It's funny that you should say that, because it is a stuckness, and it did reach a point. And it's funny, just as of this last 2 days ago, I did, in congruence and in conference with these guys, I did reach a point where it wasn't enough's enough. And I know this is just going to cycle back around if I don't, change what I'm doing and expect different results. And so I did. I drew a line in the sand, and I acted on that, and I'm determined, as much as it's within my capacity, to never go back into that vortex. And because obviously it didn't take Sherlock Holmes to figure out that 20 months is a sign of something cyclical.
Yeah. There's like a loop. There's a loop happening there. And you referenced just neuroplasticity, but like the reality is that we can't rewire our brains without overwriting our brain. You have to have a new story and a new belief and a new action in order to overwrite what's there. Like you can't just cut the circuit. Our brains don't work that way.
Yeah.
But it's true. And I think that can be like a hangover from religion too. It's just this idea like, oh, if I just pray hard enough, if I just think hard enough, if I just do something hard enough, like I can change my way of being in the world. And the reality is no, like you have to replace it. You have to replace all of it.
Yeah. I don't know about some cliches really helped me. And one of them was, you have a problem with having a problem.
Yeah.
And that's what that feels like, when I've got a problem, and I don't want to call my friends because then they'd know that I have a problem.
Yeah. Yeah. I appreciate that. And I think that's something that like this whole field of applied positive psychology makes space for. And because I remember when I was studying sort of the mantra that like the trifecta of well-being, as my instructor used to refer to is just this self-awareness needs to come first, followed by self-compassion, followed by self-care. There needs to be permission to just be human.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
Just be okay with being human.
I did feel like that's one of the things that happened to me when I left the faith. I didn't realize or couldn't have foreseen the extent in which this was true. But my gosh, did it feel like I was joining the human race for the first time.
Yeah.
It's almost like that movie, The Village. I'd gone outside the forest, I'd gone over the walls, and there's a world going on.
Yeah.
That's how subcultured I was. I mean, everybody has a different level of devotion to their faith, and I was all in.
Yeah, I was too. And it can be disorienting to step out, but it's also like so deeply enriching. And I know
freeing.
Certainly for me, I just had so much more compassion for people in the church and people outside of the church, although there's still some residual anger for me that, it's going to be a lifetime of working through. But like just so much bigger of a heart and so much more room to just let people figure things out,
Well, I mean, not only did we not imagine that we could be good without God. I mean, like that was just one of you can't be good without God. Only good in you is the Holy Spirit. So atheists are just by default evil and debauched or whatever it is, debased, only to find out that without God, with all that stuff, it's actually easier to be gooder without God.
Yeah. Yeah, Hitchens' book was great.
Yeah,
I thought.
Oh yeah.
Around that, it really unpacked a lot for me.
Okay, you're not allowed to bring up Hitchens anymore because that just reminds me of how much I hate you because you've been in the same room with him.
I don't know him. He didn't exchange eye contact even. I don't think.
Oh, okay.
If he did,
all right. I'm liking you better.
Probably sleazy. No. I mean, he can't help himself. But anyway, no, it wasn't as exciting as it sounds.
Okay, well, I can like you because it
was cool.
You haven't had that much of an advantage.
No, I really don't. There's really no advantage here. It was all just a very confusing time for us. But I'm
infatuated with him. I can't get enough. I've been YouTubing him for 10 years, and by now I've seen everything 3 or 4 times, and I'm tempted to memorize a lot of his orations.
Well, I think, I think he's brilliant and articulate and clever and charming and all of those things too. But I do feel like he is sometimes hardened, and he has never been on the inside, so he doesn't meet people with the same kind of compassion.
Oh, no, yeah. And there's times he is an asshole for sure. Sometimes,
and like, I don't know, I feel like there are other people who are maybe just a little bit softer, Dan Barker is a little bit softer sometimes.
Oh, for sure.
Sam Harris is softer in other ways, and I'm really interested in a lot of the work that he's doing right now, on many levels. And I love that he's like so engaged in everything geopolitical and connecting that back to religion of all sorts. And that's a really fascinating conversation for me.
Are you familiar with Greta Vosper up in Canada?
A little bit, yeah. I mean, I've sort of followed her stories a little, and I'm from Canada, and and like I'm pretty active in the Yale humanist community in Connecticut here, and I know that like the executive director there, I think, has met Greta. But anyway, like I'm a little familiar, and it's really interesting.
I'm just asking because a few shows back we had a guy on the show that he just really loves Greta, and probably more just that sometimes wonders why the voices for this movement are Sam Harris and versus some of the voices that are a little bit more compassionate towards people of faith and not so firebrandy or whatever. Anyway, just a thought.
Yeah, I don't know why. I think it might just be because confrontation sells, and because dogmatism takes different forms. Like I feel like people just want certainty again, and they want certainty more than they want to be compassionate or understanding. I don't know.
Yeah,
it's interesting. I don't really understand it either because I'm not drawn towards having all of the answers. I'm drawn to the pursuit of knowledge.
Yeah.
But I'm not wedded to feeling like I need to have all the answers. And I think, like, sort of, if you'd call the atheist movement a movement, I feel like there are a lot of people who just want to be certain in a different direction, and they want answers that we'll never in this lifetime have or know.
Well, and that being said, I throw that term around loosely, and I know that myself and Brian Bell and others have just said, no, I'm not in this movement. This is not. Yeah. It's almost like this is not my president, or whatever. It's just like
it's not your tribe.
It's not my tribe. Yeah.
It's not my tribe. Like, I'm not. Yeah.
Yeah, and I get it, but I am into obviously the community, and we've kind of got our own. We've got our own tribe. We've got our own vibe. We've got our own feel and context, and it's unique. And we're getting ready.
It's interesting that you have that where you are, because, like, I don't have that where I am. So like, I'm part of the Yale humanist community, but it's mostly older people. A lot of people never have been involved in a religious tradition. It's very different and interesting. And I go to a UU congregation as well. Wow. It's interesting. There are challenging things about it, but then it nourishes me enough that I find value in it. But it's just, I feel like it's just really super hard to find people who think deeply and who care deeply both.
Yeah. Well, and unless there's something to where, for lack of a better word, like in a critical way, people call it forced intimacy, but in a positive way, it's like, all right, we're going to do this event. We're all going to go see this movie together. We're all going to go out to this restaurant. We're all going to, do just intentional functions where you try to do stuff. And it's always awkward at first. And, there's things we do in our group that people whine about, but they're always grateful for it afterwards, just because there are ways to get more out of a meeting than you would if you were just schmoozing and talking about the weather. And those are intentional, and they're awkward, but if you're going to go deeper, they have to be somewhat present.
I would love to hear more about how you do that. That's something that I think a lot of people would be curious about. Like, and especially, so it sounds like you've got like at least a decent number of people in Nashville, like in your shared physical community, where you can actually get together. And I think people are super hungry for that. But like, I've looked all over Connecticut and I cannot find that. I cannot find people of the same ilk here. I just can't.
Well,
at least Catholic.
I'll talk to you about that offline, because I've said that on the show. I've talked about it on the show extensively, and so it's a little redundant for probably my listeners. But
fair enough.
And especially that episode with Peter Montoya. That's all about tools and ideas, very specific and practical tools for building community in your area.
Oh, cool.
So maybe before we get to the simple, personal, lightweight stuff, I noticed something you said that you can talk about that I'm intrigued with, and I didn't write a very good note about it. I have on the board the word conflicted leading to addiction.
Oh, yeah. So in the case of Noah, he had a lot of shame around who he was relative to who everybody wanted him to be. Mm-hmm. And I think the only thing that worked with his body and that alleviated some of that anxiety was just to forget about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So
anesthetize it or numb it or.
Yeah, to numb it and to isolate and to just not address it and to be one way in one space and another way in a different space. And I feel like I've known enough people in church communities to see that happen. And even in professional communities, I don't think it's particularly a religious problem. It's just that when people feel like they're living any kind of double life, like addiction ensues sometimes, not always, or depression or anxiety, around what if people find out. And like I'm in guilt and shame. I'm not who I'm supposed to be. I'm one person here, I'm another here. And certainly that's a struggle for any professional. It's a struggle for any human being to feel conflicted about their identity. But I think when your identity as a person is also bound up in your vocation, and then all of that is put into question, it can cause a lot of problems. And so for me, a lot of the work that I do now is actually compelled by just the terrible suffering that Noah had to go through and feeling like he couldn't be open about who he was. And that led to really self-destructive behaviors. And it didn't have to happen that way. And then there would have been a lot of shame for me in the church, or even after we left the church, in the community, the social community, who I would have drawn on for support. There would have been a lot of shame around saying, like, I think my husband's struggling with something, and I think we can't do this alone. And I know when he died, I had a friend who I said, he was drinking the night he died. And his friend said to me, and this is a dear friend who wrote his eulogy. He said to me, "Could you please not tell my wife?" And I was like, yeah, okay.
That he was drinking the night he died?
Yeah.
What's he trying to protect her from?
I don't know. The image of who they thought Noah was.
Oh, yeah.
And the tragedy, the unnecessary tragedy. And I feel like the fact that nobody wanted to acknowledge this, and I came to find out, like, actually just last year, because I contacted a few people, because I'm like, how did I not see or understand what was happening? And that the more he was wrestling with his faith, the more addiction manifested, the more self-destruction and what's the term? Self-sabotaging. His behaviors became. And like, this is all bound up in not having the freedom to be who he really felt that he was, and trying to numb himself and to placate all of these conflicting emotions. And like, to some degree, I feel like everybody who didn't want to acknowledge this is culpable.
Yep. I totally agree.
For not 10 years ago saying, like, dude, like, you have kind of a problem.
Yeah.
Like, and I came to find out that this is something that predated me, and it didn't manifest itself all the time. But, when he was wrestling deeply, addiction was something that kind of came up, and I didn't call it that. We called it a problem. We didn't call it what it was, because it didn't manifest in the way that I thought addiction manifested. I thought addiction meant somebody was slobbering drunk all the time for years on end. And, I didn't realize you could stop drinking for a few months and then start again with 2 or 3 or 4 drinks, anyway, it's tragic. And I think that there are a lot of different forms of addiction, as far as it goes, as far as it comes to numbing. Like, I think porn can be a form of addiction. I think shopping can be a form of addiction. I think there are lots of different ways that we numb our emotions. And I think that there are some socially acceptable ones and some not so socially acceptable ones.
Well, again, it goes back to moderation, because, we had said earlier that if and when that thing becomes permanent versus something that you visit every now and then, like comfort food or something, you go from treating yourself to chocolate cake every now and then versus eating it every day, that kind of thing. And
right, it comes down to self-regulation and feeling like I'm doing this intentionally, and this is serving me well for this moment in time, and I'm not avoiding life or avoiding,
Well, one word that comes up on this show, almost every show, is agency. And so if you forfeited your agency to God, and now you're just forfeiting your agency to another chemical or another practice, then, you just traded one vice for another.
Yeah, when we become dependent on it.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, that's true.
Well, this is why I'm so adamant about the lying book, where Harris prescribes, come on, bring it out. And it's hard, and obviously more people would do it, because I hear, like in Noah's story, there's a deep, dark, difficult feedback loop he's in, because he hates his duplicity, but he also knows, and he's kind of created a narrative in his head that if I be authentic, they're going to do this. And I think, and he might be alive today, who knows, had he said to himself, I'm not going to pre-write or pre-project what they're going to do or say. I'm going to be me out of respect for me, and I'm going to, out of respect for them, be me, and then let the chips fall where they may. Because truth, if the relationship's over, I have to be ready for that, or whatever. I know this is big boy stuff, but
that's layered too, because here's the thing, like, we talk about respect, but he came from a tradition that essentially says, like, there's nothing respectable about you absent of Christ. Nothing.
Oh, well, yeah. So vocabulary wise, you don't even have the tools or the knowledge or the perspective of yourself that says you deserve to be
right.
I mean, you said some things earlier where you were saying, I'm going to do what's right for me, et cetera. And we say jokingly, and I was trying to insert in there, but you're a fast talker.
Sorry.
I was going to say, you're starting to sound prideful, and it's so true about post-Christianity is all of us have to literally silence that voice of, that's prideful if you're doing something that's in your own best interest.
Right, but it's so interesting too because then we've got Brené Brown, who is this like the premier researcher on shame and vulnerability, who talks about how we all are inherently deserving of love and belonging, and yet the scriptures teach us we are undeserving.
Well, and
we are incapable of achieving anything good or acceptable in and of ourselves, and so it's like this, How do you wrap your head around that?
Well, and she's got one foot in Christianity, at least.
I know. I don't know.
That's the only thing. That's the only thing I don't like about her.
I don't mind it. I mean, if it's serving her, whatever. But I just, it feels a little bit. It feels like, have you read the Bible? Right. I don't know. But whatever. If it's serving her, let it serve her. But I think that for somebody who has maybe grown up in a different tradition that's maybe a little bit more dogmatic, this idea of being deserving of anything is a really tough. Yeah. It's a tough thing to accept when you've gone through your whole life feeling undeserving and incapable. Yeah. Absent of divine intervention.
Yep. All right, we're going to jump into the final question, speed roundy type thing, and head into the home stretch. So, do you have any pets?
I have 3. I have 2 dogs, and we sometimes have a third because my stepdaughter has a dog that is occasionally here. But we've got a puggle who is old and she smells terrible. And we've got a crossbreed, a shepherd chow mix who we got from a rescue who we absolutely love. And then we have a golden who comes to visit us sometimes.
Okay. And what are their names?
Yeah. So Suki is the crazy stinky puggle. Kuma, which means bear in Japanese, is my shepherd chow mix. And Winnie is our golden who comes to visit. All right.
Do you have any tattoos?
I don't. No.
Where's the coolest place you've ever visited, on vacation or something?
I think my favorite place that I visited is actually Puerto Rico. But actually the coolest place I visited is Amsterdam. Mm-hmm. I love Amsterdam. It's just a beautiful city with warm people and interesting streets, and it's quirky because everything is just a little bit tilted. Everything's just a little bit off. It kind of feels like, oh goodness, I can't. What's the name of the director who did the Grand Budapest Hotel? It feels like being on one of his sets.
Wes Anderson.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. Yeah, it feels like being on a Wes Anderson set. It's just a little quirky and off, which I really love. And I'm actually 100% Dutch-blooded. So even though I'm Canadian and now American, I'm a Dutch girl. Yeah. So Amsterdam is awesome.
Well, speaking of these communities that are based or were founded around this podcast, there is a community in the Netherlands that meets monthly where the people met by listening to this show.
Oh, that's awesome. That gives me a little bit of hope because at least I'm in the same country as you.
Well, it gives me a lot of pride because I can say I'm worldwide.
Yeah.
What's one of the most embarrassing moments of your life?
I don't know. Well, so I'm really notoriously bad at remembering names, and I've had many situations, and I don't know that I can think of like a specific one, but like I've had many situations where I'll be about to introduce somebody and then I can't remember their name. And so I'm at a place where I typically instruct like whoever is with me to just thrust their hand out and introduce themselves so that whoever they're shaking hands with has to give up their name because I don't trust myself to remember names.
I totally relate. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really embarrassing, actually. I can't think of one situation where that happened recently where there's this girl who I had been working with. We were taking a course together and we were each other's practicum. And so we had been doing this coaching through this life reentry program, which is all about helping people work through grief and loss and using like neuroscience to rewire the brain. And anyway, we had been working together intensely for like 4 weeks. And then when I finally met her in person, I called her by the wrong name. Oh. And it was terrible because we had shared like really personal, intimate, difficult things. And I called her by the wrong name. And then again, later in the weekend, I missaid her name. So anyway, that was recently embarrassing.
Yeah, I did the same thing as recent as 2 weeks ago. I was with my family and I saw somebody from work and they came over And she and I talked for a little bit, and then there was this moment of silence where she kind of looked at my family, and that was the prime moment to introduce her. And I did nothing. I did nothing, and my family did nothing. And they were, so literally, I think I said something like, well, it was good to see you.
Oh,
it was so bad.
You got to just coach the people around you to jump right in. Yeah, it's good. That's been my saving grace. I don't know if I'm like actually unable to remember names. I feel like it's a problem that's not going anywhere. But yeah. Oh, I'm glad you relate. It's not just me.
So, if you could have coffee with anybody, alive or dead, throughout history, who would it be?
Do you know what this is? I don't know if you'll know her, but I think it would actually be Maria Popova.
Nope.
So Maria Popova has the most brilliant blog called Brain Pickings, and it's actually part of the National Library of Congress at this juncture, like electronic archives. She is just a brilliant thinker and a collector of everything interesting. And her blog posts just weave together wisdom traditions from throughout the ages. She is definitively atheist, but I think she's also humanist, and she's just got a big heart and a big mind and is better read than anybody I'm aware of. And she just seems like a really interesting person. And she's alive, and she's actually younger than me and far more accomplished and lives in New York. She's probably 90 minutes away, but I don't think she has time for me. So
yeah, listen to that voice in your head. Yeah. You're selling yourself short. You got to try. Call her up, email her.
She's really interesting. And you know what? One thing that I do want to say for any of your listeners who are interested, like check out her blog, because that has been such a source of like deep encouragement and personal enrichment for me.
Okay.
Because she talks to philosophers and scientists and reads just so broadly that she really has helped me to construct a new worldview that I think is grounded in reality.
So her blog is called Brain Picking.
Brain Pickings with an S.
With an S.
.org.
And what's her name again?
Her name is Maria Popova.
P-O-P.
P-O-P-O-V-A.
Yeah, exactly like it sounds. Okay, one last question. Do you have or remember a favorite toy when you were a child? If so, what is it?
Oh, my favorite toy, I had this god-awful, ugly bunny rabbit that had legs that were 2 times the size of its torso, which is not anatomically even remotely resembling a bunny, but it had long bunny ears. Maybe it was a hare with extra long legs, but his name was Bunnykins, and I used to dress Bunnykins up and push him around in a little baby carriage. And Bunnykins went everywhere with me, and I'm sure he was ratty and stinky, and I think it was the closest thing to the Velveteen Rabbit that I might have owned as a child, but it was my favorite companion.
You know, we didn't talk about your religious upbringing. What was were your parents devout, and are they still?
Yeah, so, well, there's so many layers to this piece of the story. My father actually went to seminary, and he came from a Dutch Reformed tradition, ultra-conservative, Orthodox, very unforgiving, just a theology of condemnation and not much else. And my mom grew up in a Christian church, but it was like a little bit more liberal. But my dad actually went to seminary and studied, and he bottomed out 2 weeks before he graduated, and he had a nervous breakdown, and he didn't finish, and he decided he was not called to ministry. And I think that's because he also wrestled with who he was relative to the doubts he was having. And anyway, I mean, I could speculate about how sometimes mental illness is the result of strange conflicting worldviews. But anyway, I digress. But I grew up in a home where we read the Bible daily, and I grew up in an Episcopalian church. It's Anglican, actually, because I was in Canada, but like Episcopalian here. And we read the Bible every day, and I feel like my parents gifted me with something really valuable that I didn't come to appreciate until later, which was this intentional thing that we did every week, where we really thought about our place in the world and our responsibility to it. And I still feel strongly about that. And my dad, unknowingly and unintentionally, but in a way that served me really well, ripped apart the sermon every single Sunday and talked about all of the reasons why it was wrong. But then in those conversations, we would also have opportunity to talk about what was right and what was good and what was helpful. So I learned from a very young age,
critical thinking skills.
Critical thinking. And I'm really grateful for that.
Sure.
But then I just kind of lost my faith when I was in, this is sort of story. I lost my faith when I was in high school. And then when I was 21, I got pregnant out of wedlock, and I was still in college. And one of the conditions upon which my parents let me move back in the house so I could finish college was that I would have to go back to church. And so I went back to church, and we went to Baptist church. And I guess it was a church that was a little bit more critical thinking than the tradition that I came from. And so I started actually studying a little bit more. And I was like, oh, maybe some of this stuff I left prematurely and I want to understand it more. And I would say I sort of at that point really had a faith at that point. And that's when I met my first husband, Noah, who was seminary bound. And he came from a very messed up and interesting tradition. He was part of like the Sovereign Grace movement, People of Destiny prior to that. And then Orthodox Presbyterian, like he had run the gamut as far as his thinking went, and he had studied much more than I did. And so I just kind of deferred to him as far as like how to understand the scriptures and how to argue apologetics. But then when he was studying, as I referenced earlier, I started reading some of the books he was reading, and I was like, yeah, this doesn't make sense. And also my experience of the church and the people in it also doesn't make sense. Like, I don't think they believe this stuff either. Even if they think they do, I'm seeing a lot of incongruency and inconsistency. So I think I saw too much lying and hypocrisy in the church to believe that like people can have a lifestyle of that way of engaging and actually believe that there is a God that they're going to be held accountable to. Yeah. I mean, we saw so much brokenness and corruption, and I know that's not a new story. And I know that people are not perfect. Like there's plenty of room in my belief system for the imperfections of humanity, but it's just like if you actually believe that you're accountable to God, you probably wouldn't be doing this all the freaking time.
I think one of the most comforting phrases I ever heard anybody say that really does both let people off the hook for being human and points out the obvious, and that is, it seems like the world is operating exactly as it would if there was no God.
Yeah.
So the way that helped me was I used to look at like, the same problems that are outside the church are inside the church. You know, the divorce rate's the same, the pornography rate's the same, whatever. There's alcoholism's the same. And so what good is Jesus doing or whatever? And you can make it to this, this critical, hypocritical observation as opposed to, there's no God, there never was. And so the placebo only works some percentage of the time.
Yeah, but here's the thing that is interesting to me, and this is why I love humanism, is because like I can believe in God or not believe in God, but like ultimately, like I have a responsibility to my community and, the humanity of the history that got us to this place and the humanity of the people who are going to follow me. Like, ultimately, I still feel this deep sense of responsibility. And what I saw is these people who profess faith in God, like, only feel a responsibility to God or maybe feel a responsibility to other people, but only in relation to God. And it's like, if you actually feel that, the way you would be living is so differently. Like, I see so much more compassionate activism in secular communities than I do in Christian communities.
Yeah.
And I just think that people's hearts are so much more broadened when they're not feeling like they're in a place of condemnation and judgment.
One question I should have asked in the speed round that I'm going to answer for myself right now is my favorite poem is John Donne's For Whom the Bell Tolls.
Yeah,
and that's
beautiful.
That's the connection that I feel, and Bob used to say it, that when he, the interconnected web of all things is kind of a you phrase, right? Yeah. And I think that all evil, you could say almost, especially when it comes to, I don't know, one another for sure, but it's only afforded to those who have figured out a way to disconnect themselves mentally and emotionally from another person.
Yeah.
So racism says you're black, I'm white, now I can hate you. Or you're American and I'm Russian, or you're a Dallas Cowboy fan and I'm a Seattle Seahawks or whatever. It's just that place, and this is getting back to the denial of death, is that we have, in order to feel superior or feel special, we have to sometimes step off the shoulders of other people and drown them to get to the oxygen.
Yeah, and I think there's just, I think we're really hardwired towards tribalism, and like it served us well at a certain period in human history, but it's not serving us so well right now.
Yeah. So going back to your personal life, I just can't hardly hang up the phone with you because I got to get, there's several things that have come up, but you got any siblings?
Yeah, I do actually. I have four siblings. I have an older sister. I have an older brother. I have two younger sisters, one of whom is adopted. I'm closest probably to my youngest sister. And I say that I'm close to all of them, but I'm closest to my youngest sister because I can actually be really honest with her about everything and not feel like I have to hide any part of who I am or what I've done.
The other three are religious still?
So my oldest sister is actually a Jehovah's Witness, which was the ultimate act of rebellion against my father.
Oh, okay.
So he doesn't actually know that I'm a humanist. I'm pretty sure if he found out I was humanist, then I would fall in the ranks. Right now, I think that she's the black sheep, which is interesting. But my brother attends church, but I think it's just very much a cultural thing. I don't really know what he believes, and his life doesn't really show a lot of evidence of like peacefulness in his faith. So. And then my sister who's adopted, who's a couple years younger than me, she's not deeply religious. It's more of like a cultural thing for her too. She wants to be a good person, but she's not like a deep thinker either. And she doesn't really, I mean, I think that she's just been conditioned and she's comfortable in, wherever she is. And then my youngest sister, no, she's just a hedonist. She's an apostate like me.
So are your parents still alive?
Yeah, my parents are still alive. I love them deeply, and honestly, a big part of the reason why it's been so hard for me to talk about a lot of this stuff openly is because my parents have been this tremendous source of love and support for me. And like certainly when I was an unwed mother at 21, and then when I was a widow at 36, like my parents have been this incredible source of love and devotion. And I wouldn't say that they certainly don't accept everything about my life. They're not proud of everything that I've done, but like my parents are awesome and I would never want to do anything to disappoint or hurt them. And I know that the truth of who I am would be disappointing and maybe a little bit hurtful. Yeah. So there's the rub. Like I love my parents. They're still very religious. My dad will always be concerned for my eternal salvation. That's not going to change.
So you're on this show incognito. You're going by Rachel.
So I am remarried, and that's my husband's last name. Although I didn't actually take it.
Oh, okay.
When we were married.
Well, and we don't even have to use that. We can just call you Rachel for that matter. I mean,
yeah, that's fine.
But you're not out on this episode.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not really. Like I want to connect with other people. And there's a part of me that kind of wants to be out, and then there's a part of me that's like I don't want to hurt my parents. And then here's the messy thing, Cass. Like, I was deeply in love with this person who died and who had like just a really messy history of, an abusive family of origin and like a ridiculous church that told him he was a prophet. And then all of these identity issues and addiction issues and all of these things. And like, it's hard to talk about somebody who's not here and who can't tell his part of the story or his version of the story. But I think for me, what compels me is just never wanting anybody to have to go through what he went through, because I believe that he probably would still be alive if he had better support and if he had been connected with other people wrestling with the same thing.
Yeah.
So
sure.
that's what compels me. And so being out, not being out, like it's hard to stay in hiding. And by the same token, I feel like these things need to be said aloud.
Yeah. Well, we are going to use your picture, right?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. But just your name is searchable more from a Google search engine, whereas your picture's not.
And that would be great.
Yeah. And so if somebody wanted to talk to you about their own grief or their own issues or get some help or advice, is there some way they can reach you?
Yeah, they can reach me through the Flourishing Beyond Belief website, or they could email me. So I do other work around resilience training and coaching. And maybe this is important, I don't know, but like I'm actually not actively taking clients right now, mostly because I just don't have the bandwidth. I'm going to be studying in the new year. And so I'm not looking for a lot of engagement, but I am looking to connect with other people, and I'm very happy to provide resources to other people. And if somebody wants to talk to me and to tell me a little bit about their story, I'm happy to send resources that I think would be helpful.
Yeah. Well, I've already added you to the Facebook group that's confidential and private, and so you can be yourself there, and that'll help. I mean, it's a great thing. We're doing a retreat in October in a lake house over in the Smokies.
That sounds awesome.
It sleeps 40. It's a huge 3-story house. Well, come. I'll
I don't know if I can.
I'll send you the information. It's the weekend of October 14th, and anybody else listening that wants to go, just contact me. And it's basically $200 a piece for 2 nights and food and fun. There's actually an indoor pool on the bottom floor of that house. And
oh my God, that sounds awesome. Good for you.
And, it's not a lot of an agenda. We will have a couple of meetings where we introduce ourselves and we, kind of do a brief check-in with everybody. But for the most part, it's just hanging out and getting to know each other and maybe smoking pot. I don't know what's going to happen.
But you're open.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so funny. That sounds awesome. I don't know if I could make it or not, but I would love to learn more about it. And I love that you're serving people in that way. I think it's really valuable and important. And I think there's a lot of hunger for community of connection. So
when you do something like in the name of God that was partially in your wheelhouse, partially was very fulfilling. I mean, we didn't stay in it for 20 years. It hasn't lasted for 2000 because it's all bunk.
Yeah.
And so the good part of what I loved about church, I've just kind of brought with me and adapted it and found a way to, they call me the atheist pastor. There's all kinds of terms and references about it. Like you're my secular chaplain and all of that. And so
I get that.
I love doing it. It's fun.
I totally get that because, here, the truth of the matter for me is that I still love ministry.
Yeah.
Like I love serving people. I love companioning people and walking alongside them.
Yeah.
It's beautiful.
And we're able to do it without these silly notions of anointing or hierarchy or prophetic or in the naturalist worldview. We're just all humans, but fucked up humans doing the best we can, trying to get our way through this life, hard and cold and miserable and brutal world. And so if we get a laugh here and there, or we get a hug, or we get a tear, boy, we've hit pay dirt, That's the way I feel. I've got a real low bar for life satisfaction.
Well, you know what, though? But your bar for life satisfaction, what I'm hearing, is around connecting with other people in a meaningful way. That's the recipe. That's all we need.
Well, and I also have a little bit of, what is it, Sartre that said hell is other people? I do. I have a love-hate relationship.
There are some terrible people. Yeah. I agree.
And so there's times when I'm just disgusted by humanity. Maybe when I go to Walmart or something. I don't know. But that's just...
Oh, God. You're so not alone in that. I feel the same way.
Well, and then I feel bad for being a snob and feeling superior and... Okay, thank you for calling and for talking, and I found you to be extremely fascinating. In fact, a second ago when you said that you kind of in the early years of your marriage, you deferred to your husband, and I thought, I don't see you deferring to anybody anymore.
One would think. I don't know. I mean, I really, he was just a really brilliant person, and he had spent a lot of time thinking about these things more than I. And
well, it was also the thing to do for you. I mean, that's what the Bible told you to do.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a thing to do. And also, I always felt like he was I just felt like he was brilliant. I'm like, clearly, if this person who's brilliant and who has studied this and thought about this far more than I have, clearly I can defer to him to explain all things and be, a good submissive wife, as the case may be. And, and as it turned out, when I did have opinions about things, sometimes there was conflict between us.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Well, if he was smarter than you, then he was a genius. And I have a theory that all smart people are going to have some degree of depression. And so I think it's just unavoidable. Because, if ignorance is bliss, knowledge is misery.
Well, it's mixed. Those are polarities too. I don't know.
I always go there. I'm a very binary thinking. It sucks.
You got to make some space for a little bit of gray, a little bit of variation of color in there. Softens things. But
you can't. You would concur that the more you know, the more apt you are to be hopeless at times.
Yeah, sometimes, and I think too that's because our brains we want certainty, and there are some things that we'll never feel certain about, and so some of that might just be hubris, just the frustration of not being able to figure things out. And I do agree, like the most intelligent people I know are prone to depression, and I know a lot of really smart people, and I think that's part of the human experience when you think deeply. It just is, because we can't reconcile all of these things.
All right. Good talk. See you out there. Thanks a lot.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Cass. Take care.
So that's my talk with Rachel. I hope that you benefited and maybe got some tools to deal with grief, especially grief without God. And she mentioned these 25 strengths, that there's a personality test type thing that can help you recognize your strengths. And it's www.viacharacter.org. And there's a link to Maria Pavlov's blog, Brain Pickings, that she referred to in the show. We taped this conversation on July 29th, 2018. The intro and segue music is by Dave Weckel, called Just Groove Me. Thanks for listening, and be a yes-sayer to what is.